Hello and good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out. Thank you all for joining us this evening for another event by the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs. We're so glad you're here. My name is Kimberly Flowers, and I'm the Executive Director of the Goldfarb Center. And tonight, we have a very special guest that I can't wait for you to hear from. I will say that today, I think, might be one of my favorite days ever at Colby because I got to spend the day with Nadine Strossen. So you are in for a treat tonight. You're going to really enjoy it. And to tell you about our speaker and who we're going to be listening and learning from, we have Avery Marty, a senior with our Goldfarb Senior Executive, a senior with our Goldfarb Student Executive Board. Avery, over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Avery Marty. I'm a senior member of the Goldfarb Student Executive Board, and I'm so excited to introduce our speaker for the evening, Professor Nadine Strossen. The Goldfarb Center's annual theme this year is freedom of speech, and tonight we have a leading scholar in that field to kick off our programming related to free speech. Professor Strossen is the John Marshall II Professor of Law at New York University, a recipient of the American Bar Association's prestigious Margaret Brent Women's Lawyer Achievement Award, and recognized by the National Law Journal as one of America's 100 most influential lawyers. Prior to joining NYU, she was the youngest and first female president of the American Civil Liberties Union. She remains a member of the ACLU's National Advisory Council and serves on the board of various other professional organizations. In 1995, she published 2 books, the first titled Speaking of Race, Speaking of Sex, Hate Speech, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties, and the second, Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights, which was named a notable book of 1995 by the New York Times. Her most recent book is titled Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech and Not Censorship. The work has been praised by an ideologically diverse field of scholars. It introduces an approach to understanding the relationship between hate speech and the freedom of speech, both in the United States and in the context of international human rights law. Professor Strossen takes a thought-provoking stance, discouraging censorship and encouraging discourse to combat hate speech. Professor Strossen actually was one of the earliest Cotter debates, which many of you attended last week, and she will be signing books afterwards for those who are interested. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nadine Strossen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Avery. Well done. And that book that she mentioned, we have some books out, so feel free to grab a copy for yourself. If we have extras at the end, you can take one for a friend to tell them they missed out on tonight. But Nadine will stick around to sign the books for those that are interested. Nadine, thanks for coming all the way to Maine.
Thank you for having me. And it's such a beautiful place to be.
It is. I think to start, this is going to be a real free-flowing conversation this evening, and we'll have plenty of time for questions for you. But I think to start, because you are an inaugural speaker related to free speech, and we have such an amazing slate of speakers coming to speak throughout the academic year, but I think to just start us off is, what does free speech mean to you? What is free speech?
Wow, that is a huge question. I will try to not give a really long answer. But the essence, and please forgive me, Kimberly, I'm going to face the other members of the audience. To me, the essence of free speech is the right of every single individual, including at a very young age, as soon as we are able to formulate our own thoughts and beliefs, to have the freedom to express them without anybody having the power to punish us or silence us solely because they disagree with or disapprove of the ideas or the beliefs that we are expressing. Beyond that, if we're talking about speech in certain contexts that causes certain specific, imminent, serious harm that's directly caused by the speech, then it can be limited. But it can never be limited just because of that idea, that viewpoint, the message.
And how does it relate to the First Amendment? I think there's a lot of confusion about it always relates to the First Amendment. It doesn't. It's always protected by the First Amendment. It isn't.
That's, again, a really good question, because the concept of free speech that I laid out to you happens to coincide with how in modern times the Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment. But for most of our history, the Supreme Court did allow government to censor speech solely because its viewpoint, its idea, its belief was disapproved of. And that's why throughout, until the second part of the 20th century, people could be censored and punished by government because they had ideas that were rejected by the majority. I mean, this is why Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. His ideas were considered, unpatriotic and subversive and dangerous. This is why communists and socialists and labor union activists and protesters against World War I were jailed. 15,000 people who peacefully expressed their opposition to the war and the draft were jailed for it, including members of the clergy who said that that the war was inconsistent with their religious principles. So I have a concept of free speech that until quite recently in our history did not overlap with what the First Amendment protected. So the First Amendment has, starting in the 1960s, been interpreted in a very speech protective way, including to protect our right to express unpopular viewpoints. And it's also true that in recent years, international human rights law that protects free speech also has been interpreted in a very speech protective way. But there are many, many important contexts where those legal standards are not going to come to your defense. So the First Amendment, along with virtually every rights protecting provision in the Constitution, only protects us against government action. So we have a free First Amendment free speech right to not to have government punish us for conveying an unpopular viewpoint. But we don't have that right vis-a-vis any private sector actors. So I hate to tell you this, but at this wonderful private sector educational institution, you have no First Amendment free speech rights at all. If you're working for a private sector company, you have no First Amendment free speech rights at all. If you're trying to convey your ideas on a private platform, whether it be social media, whether it be traditional media, you have no First Amendment free speech rights at all. There are, however, other sources of law that can potentially provide protection against non-government actors.
Well, you brought up both some domestic and international issues, and as many know, because I often talk about my career has been international development, so I'm always looking at more of the global perspective. So talk to us first. I'd like to hear what aspects of this free speech issues are uniquely American? What are the things, or maybe there isn't anything that's uniquely American, but what is it about our country that has free speech issues that maybe is more particular to the United States than other places?
I would say that the issues really are universal. And even before globalization, if you read history about countries around the world, societies around the world, there have been perennial issues of individual freedom versus community control, government control. A friend of mine just did an amazing history of free speech going back to ancient times, and he looks at cultures around the world, and it's just absolutely, these are eternal issues that philosophers have debated, political scientists have debated. Many people think that the United States is exceptionally strong in our protection of speech. And that is generally true, but there are really two important qualifications. When it comes to what the Supreme Court often calls political speech, which is a term that it uses not for just partisan political speech, but speech about policy matters, matters of public concern. It is true that we do have unusually strong protection, consistent with our democratic republic. I mean, the opening words, I've got my little constitution, as I'm sure you also never go anywhere without yours, right? So you all know that the opening words are, we the people. We the people who wield sovereign power, how can we do that effectively without the most robust freedom of speech, including to criticize government policies, to criticize those we elect to be accountable to us? And so consistent with that, again, only in modern times has the Supreme Court really lived up to that ideal, the aspiration, and allowed individuals to very strongly critique government officials and other public figures, even to the extent of false, defamatory statements about them. Not absolutely protected, but as you well know, because it's been covered in many films and TV shows, that a public official can be the subject of false defamatory speech unless that official can show that the speaker either intentionally lied or acted with recklessness. And that's why Donald Trump kept saying that he wanted to change the libel laws, because he felt that people could too easily say false and defamatory things about him. He was constantly saying false and defamatory things about other people, so he benefited from that speech protective approach. And then this topic of hate speech, as many of you may know, hateful speech is more strongly protected in this country than it is in most other countries. But the second qualification I want to make is that under international human rights free speech law, under the major United Nations treaties to which most countries in the world are bound, hateful speech is protected almost as strongly as it is in our system. And that's really important, because there's been a lot of advocacy recently that the social media companies, given their global reach, should be subject to, or should voluntarily align their content moderation standards with these international UN treaty standards. And that, in fact, is what the Facebook Oversight Board has been enforcing, and it ends up being quite speech protective with respect to hate speech. I guess, I said my second qualification. That was my first qualification. My second one, to the generalization that the U.S. law tends to be more speech protective. There is one topic about which American law is quite censorious, much more so than the laws of many other countries, including European countries. It's a subject that has always been particularly sensitive in our culture. And if this were a class of mine, I would ask, does anybody have an educated guess? Can I do that?
Yes, of course.
Does anybody have an educated guess? What topic is American law less protective of than the law of many other countries? Something that we're...
Be brave, just take a guess.
Think of our puritanical heritage. I see Victoria, you were raising your
Victoria.
hand.
However, since it is live stream, we're going to do our mic runners a little early. So
sorry.
Sorry, Laura. I know, right? But this is, you got to be spontaneous
exercise
sometimes. And also when you get the mic, Victoria, see, this is what happens when you come to lunch with Nadine, right?
And ask
but
very
this
good
is the
questions.
Case. This is the case for anybody. Whenever we get to you for questions, please do state your name and your major. Thanks.
Oh my gosh! Wait.
You can do it.
I'm Victoria. I'm a freshman, but I want to major in Gov and Philosophy with a minor in Chinese. and I raised my hand, but then I put it down when you mentioned that there was like a religious component to it.
Well, but what were you going to say?
I thought you were alluding to like emergency situations, like calling fire, like calling the
But
shooter
that's
in the
but that would be an exception under every legal system. And I'm asking about, so we're especially protective of speech about policy matters and public officials. Is there another topic where our laws are much more, our constitutional First Amendment law is much less protective? It's a topic that's quite sensitive in our culture, and I'm referred to our puritanical heritage. That was my hint. Wild guess?
Oh, got a couple.
Well, if it's puritanical, my name's Dev. I'm a prospective government major. If it's puritanical, then I'd guess like sex and nudity.
Yeah, that's a very good guess. And the truth is, I mean, my European friends are always mocking Americans for, the Supreme Court created out of whole cloth this so-called obscenity exception to the First Amendment for speech that is about sexual matters that are, patently offensive to the majority of the community without having to satisfy that standard of showing that there's an emergency. The Supreme Court just says, it's sort of like, we know that speech about sex is inherently dangerous, at least to children. And the broadcast media still are extremely, the Supreme Court has upheld their power, that means over-the-air radio and TV, to use four-letter words, to use so-called patently offensive language or indecent language, and it's absurd. Since we're not using the broadcast media here, I'm going to exercise my First Amendment right and say there's a very important First Amendment case. It had to do with political speech, namely opposition to the Vietnam War, but the particular message was fuck the draft. And I cannot describe that case on radio or TV without getting bleeped. I mean, the word is, we now use it constantly, right? It's in the pages of the Supreme Court reports, but it can't be said over the air. So we are censorious in that domain.
Well, you brought up in your previous answer, you talked about hate speech and social media, which I definitely want to dive into. But before we go there, I want to still stick on to the global versus domestic, because globally, what are some of the touch points or countries that are most on your mind in terms of free speech, and what are some of the major issues that other countries are going through that we are not dealing with here? I know there's a lot, so maybe just pick a couple examples.
As unfortunately came out through some of the participants from other countries in our dinner session, there are journalists who are being assassinated at the behest of the government in countries all over the world, journalists who are being imprisoned and detained all over the world for daring to criticize government officials or policies. I mean, where journalism really is a dangerous profession. And so for all of the serious challenges that we have to free speech, and people would say journalism is dying in other ways through, being economically, their newspapers are literally dying all over the country, local news, but thank goodness it's not through that kind of state-sanctioned violence.
And which countries do you think of? I think of like maybe Ethiopia, China, Mexico came up tonight. Are there particular countries that sort of pop to mind?
I would say, so many, as I think of friends of mine who are living in Hungary or Turkey, so we don't have to think of strictly totalitarian countries, more authoritarian countries, including within Europe. And even, the United Kingdom certainly doesn't have this problem of murders, but going back to the issue of defamation, a lot of people will say, well, what's the big deal? If there are it's much easier to bring a defamation lawsuit in Britain than it is in the United States. They're not an authoritarian country, but the truth is there is a tremendous amount of self-censorship and journalists not being willing to criticize government officials and government policies. A very prominent First Amendment lawyer named Floyd Abrams wrote an op-ed in the New York Times within the last week in which he gave examples of the kinds of criticisms of government officials that we take for granted in this country that have sent journalists to, not to prison, they don't have criminal libel, but and what usually happens is they self-censor because they don't want to face the risk of paying economic damages that would put their publications out of business.
Right. Well, let's go to hate speech in your book. The title's a bit provocative, probably purposely so, but you know, in the book you talk a lot, of course, the legal perspective, right, about hate laws and why they're ineffective, or sort of like why we should still resist this. And I'm sure the question you get a lot, which was my first initial reaction when I saw the headline, is like, but hate speech can be really harmful and hurtful and really kind of, you know, how could we really allow all hate speech? So speak to a little bit about that question, which I'm sure you get often, and sort of where that line should be drawn, because while I agree with free speech for all, I get nervous about thinking about how I've seen, especially the online proliferation of hate speech and how hurtful that can be.
Well, with all due respect, and everybody has our own perspectives, I don't think that the title is provocative, and I didn't intend it to be, because it's hate, why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. So the main point is we have to resist hate. And I completely accept and enthusiastically support the goal of those who advocate censorship, which is we have to eradicate or at least reduce hatred, discrimination, stereotyping, hateful violence. But I remain convinced, and I will put that in the present tense because I'm always eager to second guess and hear arguments and evidence but so far I remain convinced that no matter how well intended censorship is, it is not an effective way to reduce either hateful attitudes, right, what the underlying cause that is expressed in the speech, and it certainly doesn't have anything to do with ending actual discriminatory conduct. You know, the United States, and I'm a full-time critic of our government falling short of protecting civil liberties, but I do have to say, compared to other countries, even though we do not censor hate speech as they do, we were the first to enact and enforce anti-discrimination laws. So we had many countries that were very busy, you know, we're doing something about hate, we're stopping you from saying hateful things, when it was still completely legal to actually discriminate openly, blatantly, on the basis of race, religion, gender, so forth, in employment and housing and many important spheres. So one of the things as a civil libertarian and human rights crusader is often censorship is like this politically cheap, quick fix that politicians can say, oh, I'm doing something about this problem. I'm stopping people from talking about it, and avoiding digging deeper and making real structural changes. And if I can add something else, Kimberly, even the most speech protective system, which would include the United States and, as I said, international law under UN treaties, does not absolutely protect all speech with a hateful message. It is true, as I alluded to earlier, that the sole fact that the message is hateful or hated by us is not a justification for censoring it. And that's usually called the content neutrality principle or the viewpoint neutrality principle. But once you get beyond the content of the message and you look at it in its overall context, then our law does appropriately allow a lot of hateful speech, or speech with any other message for that matter, to be punished. And I think I summarized that before, but basically, if but only if, in the particular facts and circumstances, the speech directly threatens certain specific, serious, imminent harm. And let me give you an example of that will distinguish, a real-world example, that you can't punish speech solely because of disapproval of its content, but that very same content in a context where it presents an emergency, this is sometimes summarized as the emergency principle, can be punished. And it comes from Charlottesville in 2017. I'll never forget it. August 11th, these neo-Nazi, white supremacists, alt-right, Unite the Right, are demonstrating, chanting the most odious slogans. You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. I've said that, quoted it countless times, and it just sends shivers down my spine every time I do, because my father almost died in a German concentration camp. Yet the sole fact that that message is absolutely repugnant cannot be a justification for censorship. I continue to believe that because I think about other messages that have been deemed repugnant by other communities to this day. There are communities, the ACLU has cases where Black Lives Matter advocacy is considered to be hate speech. It's considered to be hate speech against non-Black people or against police officers. And I know that, part of the reason why the civil rights demonstrators always opposed censoring hate speech was because their speech was seen as hateful. So I stand by that principle. But when those marchers masked menacingly and surrounded at close distance the counter-demonstrators that were ringing the statue of Thomas Jefferson on the University of Virginia campus, and I've been there and I visualize it exactly, and brandishing lighted tiki torches, that crossed the line. And the Supreme Court actually has recognized it's recognized a number of categories of speech that satisfy that general emergency principle, and this one is called a true threat. True because we use the word threatening very loosely in everyday speech. I feel threatened by the fact that Milo Yiannopoulos is speaking on my campus, kind of thing. No, that's not punishable. But when the speaker is directly targeting a small audience, particular people, small group of people, and intends to instill a reasonable fear that they are going to be subject to physical harm, that is a punishable true threat. And notice that the speaker does not have to intend to actually cause the harm, because a reasonable means it's an objective standard, not a subjective one. So if you're really thin-skinned and easily frightened, that doesn't count. But if a reasonable person in your position would fear that you're going to be subject to attack, that's already causing you harm, even if you don't actually receive the attack. Because why? It's going to deter your freedom of movement. You're going to be deterred from exercising your free speech rights. As a counter demonstrator, I'm not going to put my life and physical safety on the line. So that, I think it's a very common sense distinction. And our law, here's the way I like to summarize it. Our law it allows, here's the neat way to put it, our legal system outlaws the speech that is the most dangerous, but it also outlaws the censorship that is the most dangerous. And the most dangerous form of censorship is empowering government to pick and choose among ideas that are disliked. I mean, that's antithetical not only to individual liberty, but to our democracy.
We've talked a lot today, and just also among students on these topics, about cancel culture and about sort of what is, I would say, the trends or where we are today in terms of our political polarization. You've been working on this for a long time. So I'm curious of like what's not new and what is new? Meaning, like, you know, is cancel culture really new? Are we really more politically divided than ever before, or does it just feel that way? You know, is there trends around free speech that you've sort of seen that are happening today that didn't happen 10 years ago?
That is such a great question. And I have to say, I think that the same issues recur in slightly different factual contexts, but ultimately the same issues are at stake. So today people demonize, it's very popular to demonize social media. What's interesting, because it's the newest, most powerful medium, and I'm old enough to recall other new media, including when the internet itself was a new medium, and before that cable, and I was a kid when TV was fairly new, and then I've read about when radio was, you know, I've read about when the printing press was new, I've read about when writing was new, and every new medium is always greeted in the same way. Those of us who are in favor of freedom and human rights think, this is a wonderful new opportunity for more of us to be able to exchange and express ideas and information and to advocate for human rights. Isn't that wonderful? And those with a different attitude, oh, this is so dangerous. Ideas and information are going to be available to all of those people, you know, including people who will be vulnerable, people not like us, children. Children are always a main source of concern. So I think, to me, I see a lot of similarity. And it's true that the harms, and by the way, it's what we humans say that the media transmits. So if the expression is negative for any reason, it's because we humans are saying something negative and the media transmit it. But we also use the very same media to transmit a lot of positive. And I think it's, you know, having the historical perspective of, I'm very proud that the ACLU is the organization, I was president at the time, very involved in it, that litigated all the way to the Supreme Court the landmark first decision by the court about freedom of speech online. In fact, it was the very first case that held anything about the Constitution in cyberspace. And we had, you know, thank goodness we won that case, but it was a very uphill battle because the reaction by Congress when they became aware of the internet was, wow, this is going to make it so easy to get information to children and for children to receive information that might be harmful to them. And we have to protect children from, you know, from the earlier part of our conversation, what was considered to be the most dangerous kind of expression that can now easily reach young people about sex, right? So that same old formulation that outlaws sexual expression, including, you know, 4-letter words on broadcast TV, was transposed to the internet. A law was passed called the Communications Decency Act that outlawed any expression that was considered patently offensive or indecent. And the ACLU challenged it, representing you know, horrible pornographers such as the ACLU itself, Human Rights Watch. Why? Because we are putting out information, among other things, about sexual violence against women and, You know, a lot of those depictions could well be considered indecent and patently offensive. We, at that time, long before there was majority support for LGBTQ rights, forget it, that was a very unpopular cause. Still at that time, states were passing all kinds of discriminatory laws. The Supreme Court had never upheld any kind of rights in that domain, so we represented a lot of LGBTQ publications because, of course, their expression was inherently considered patently offensive and indecent in many parts of the United States. Anyway, Congress passed that law with almost no negative votes. I mean, it was just so popular to be in favor of decency and against indecency. Nobody dared vote against it. The Clinton administration defended it, and the landmark decision that we won, I'm so proud, is called Reno. That was Janet Reno, Bill Clinton's Attorney General, versus ACLU. And we got those 9 elderly justices who probably had never been online, amazingly, to stand up for freedom of speech online. And to me, it's a recurring issue. Now, I will say that there's one new thing that is being done by social media, or allegedly being done, because one of the problems is they are so untransparent about exactly what they are doing, so we only have partial information. But I think there is sufficient evidence to be very concerned that they are engaging in unprecedentedly granular and pervasive surveillance of all of our online communications in a way that other media simply did not have the technological capability to do, and then using that unprecedented treasure trove from their perspective of information to use through algorithms and AI to drive content toward us in ways that we are not even aware of, let alone have consented to. And to me, that is a violation of not only individual privacy, but also of free speech. Because, as I said earlier with your great opening question, to me, the essence of free speech is an individual freedom of choice. What we think, what we believe, what information we convey, what ideas we convey, what information we receive, what ideas we receive. And we can't make meaningful choices, assuming that that information is a correct description. If that's correct, then we are being manipulated, we are being used. That's the opposite of freedom of choice. So despite the fact that I believe that communications companies, including social media companies, should have their own First Amendment rights to make their own editorial decisions about what is said and what is not said on their platforms, I don't think they should have the right to use us and manipulate us as pawns in that system. So I would certainly support regulation that would be in the nature of protecting our privacy, requiring a radical increase in transparency, and giving all of us the opportunity to notice full information and to opt into the content curation decisions. That my ideal would be user agency, that we should have the freedom to choose knowingly what information we receive and what we don't receive, that we should have a wealth of options in terms of filtering and curation. It should not just be one size fits all, or for that matter, whatever they choose to send to us individually without our notice and consent.
We're going to turn to the audience next, but wow, time went by really fast. This is what happens when you're talking to Nadine. But before we turn to the audience, because you already started to touch on it, but I have to ask about public policy, because one of the really purposes of the Goldfarb Center is thinking about the role of public policy as we think about the current events that are happening in the day. So do you feel like whether it's social media regulations or Like, are those the public policy issues that we should have our eyes on most when we're thinking about free speech issues? Or what are the public policy things that you think of when you're thinking of free speech?
Well, there definitely are just a very large number of public policy issues about social media regulation, as indicated by the fact that can't keep track of the number of proposed bills in Congress all across the spectrum. Not only Congress, but state legislatures as well. And then in terms of campus policies, I think that's a really fertile area, because your school is not alone in having policies that govern what speech is protected on the part of students, faculty members, staff. Usually it falls into different subcategories. So, what speech will be protected in so-called free speech zones, open areas of campus, versus what will be protected in classrooms or in dormitories, what will be protected for employees as opposed to students. And I think that this to me is an area where it would be so educational as well as impactful for students who are concerned about these issues to devise their own proposed policies. What do you think would be the ideal campus policy to deal with each of these issues? And I could go into a lot more detail to mention a number of controversies that have occurred, particularly in law school where I teach. And you have cases that the Supreme Court has decided. I hate to shock you if you're a student of American history. You know that the Supreme Court has issued decisions that are shockingly racist by today's perspective, and not surprisingly include language that is deeply demeaning. Shockingly so from today's perspective. The Dred Scott case, I'm sure people have heard of, and Plessy versus Ferguson, and law professors who teach constitutional law are seriously questioning whether they should continue to teach these cases. And the argument against it is it's so traumatizing for students to have to confront the racist thoughts, the white supremacist language. I hope you can imagine an argument the other way, but it's a serious issue worthy of discussing. And then maybe there should be different approaches. So some professors are saying, well, okay, they should be familiar with what the holding is, but we'll just give them like a nutshell version. This is what the Supreme Court held, and we're not going to require them to actually read that deeply problematic language. And then others will say, oh, they should read that language, but we shouldn't read it aloud in class. Or there are cases where the Supreme Court has dealt with free speech rights or lack of free speech rights for members of the Ku Klux Klan, and will include in the case a transcript of the speech that was used, and you won't be surprised that racist slurs are included, because that's the way these people talk. And there have been very serious debates in law schools. Should we not be allowed, and at least one law school, Rutgers, in the spring, there was a very serious effort to categorically ban ever quoting in class any such language, even if it was directly relevant to the legal issue in the case. And it seems to me when we have these kinds of controversies, we might as well discuss in advance and have ground rules. And I think, different communities, I'm using law school as an example, different colleges might come out differently, but I think it would be so interesting and useful for students to grapple with these precise controversies and propose what they would think would be the appropriate ground rules, either for a particular class that they're in or for their campus. And then ideally, I tell you, there might even be money in this if you come up with a pamphlet or a little book that could be bought by colleges around the country to follow your proposed guidelines, because they're all, and not only colleges, but law schools.
Okay, let's go to the audience. It's gonna have to be sort of lightning round, but raise your hand if you have a question, and we will do 3 at a time, so we'll take a couple. And remember to
I
say
should have brought
your
a
name.
pencil.
I have a pen. Would you like a pen and a
thank
piece
you
of
so
paper?
much. I've got paper.
You've got
here.
paper? Okay.
All right.
Go ahead.
Thank you for giving the talk. I'm Aaron,
Aaron,
government and global studies major and East Asian studies minor. I was curious what your thoughts are on the extension of political speech that encapsulates money, specifically in politics. So maybe if you could weigh in on the Citizens United case, perhaps, and if you think that's decided correctly, was that a valid reading in your view of kind of the First Amendment and political speech? So, yeah.
Great question,
thank you.
Aaron. Others? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk again. I'm Dev, prospective government major, first year. I wanted to ask about this idea of a paradox of tolerance or a paradox of intolerance, as I'm sure you've heard of it. The idea that intolerance of intolerant ideas is not intolerance itself, and by extension, free speech. Like, should free speech that says free speech should not be allowed be allowed? Would it lead to the extinction of free speech if there was unlimited free speech? Like, what do you think about that idea?
And I think, I see you have a question too, but I think we have one in the back. We'll still get to you, but on the back, yeah, you have the microphone. Go
Okay,
ahead.
so when I was in
What's your name, please?
Oh, I'm Celia, and I plan to major in sociology and psychology. So when I was in high school, during a school meeting, an American student attacked China and saying some nonsense, in my opinion. And I see that as hate speech as a Chinese, and I feel offended. But I also recognize that that's how China is portrayed in American social media and like all kinds of mainstream media. So my question is that should the definition of hate speech be American-centered, or should it be maybe more from an international perspective?
Okay, 3 excellent questions, and
We'll get back to you.
I could spend a long time on each of them, so I'm going to kind of self-censor. Aaron, money in politics. I happen to be a tiny minority among liberals, in the sense of political liberals, who think that Citizens United was correctly decided. But that is really beside the point, because Citizens United included a lot of different holdings. There are a lot of different legal issues. And the specific issue that you raised is actually one that was not controversial at all on the Supreme Court. Even though the Supreme Court was divided 5-4, they were divided about another issue in the case, and the predicate issue of whether restricting the expenditure of money to advance a political message should be considered to raise a First Amendment issue. That was 9-0 by the Supreme Court. There's a long line of cases in which the court has said all kinds of restrictions on your ability to spend money would naturally limit how much you can say, how effectively you can say it. And so, the language in the First Amendment, I'm sure you've all committed it to heart, but it is Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And the Supreme Court, so the crucial term there is, does a limit on how much you can spend constitute an abridgment? And for a long time, long before Citizens United, in an unbroken line of decisions, the Supreme Court has interpreted abridgment in a very pragmatic sense as a functional, practical matter. Can you convey less speech? Can you reach fewer people in the audience? Does your message go less far as a result of this government action? And the answer to that is yes. And a lot of the cases actually involved not-for-profit organizations and charitable organizations and advocacy organizations. You better believe that that was one of the tools that southern states tried to use against the NAACP to halt its civil rights advocacy. Now, just so you know, freedom of speech is not absolute, and to say that, well, it does trigger a First Amendment claim to have your right to spend money restricted, but that's not the end of the case. The question is, well, is there a sufficient justification? Do these particular restrictions do more good than harm? And that's where the real debate was. And we could say a lot more about that, but forgive me, I'm going to go on to the next question, the paradox of tolerance. And there, Dev, I always come back to what is there's absolutely no doubt that when tolerate is even too insipid a word for me. I know you were giving an example that appealed to me. I appreciate that. I welcome arguments against free speech, even though I recognize that they might ultimately lead to people deciding that they don't want free speech and trying to do something about it. Because the question is, as compared to what? As compared to government deciding what is intolerable. And I keep thinking, and to me, that's like the cure is worse than the disease. And I always keep thinking of Winston Churchill's famous aphorism about democracy. Yeah, it's the worst system there is, except for the alternatives. And it may be my civil libertarian instincts. Whom do I distrust more? My fellow members of this community? I deliberately don't say citizen because non-citizens have free speech rights too, as the Supreme Court has recognized. Or who, do I distrust them more than I distrust the government? I'm not one of these anti-government people, but people in power tend to act in ways that perpetuate their power. So I would rather have the opportunity to persuade and engage with members of my community than government. And we gave examples from around the world, and we've seen recent examples in this country as well of desperate efforts to preserve power at all costs on the part of, and I guess that's another old aphorism. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And then to Sarah's question, if I understood you correctly, you were talking about American students attacking policies of the Chinese government. Is that correct? Yeah. And it, should that be considered hate speech, even assume for the sake of arguments that it is false and defamatory, that they've got incorrect information, they're lies, and they're defaming the Chinese government. As I would say, that they have the right to falsely defame the U.S. government and U.S. government officials. That is the most important kind of speech in a democratic republic. James Madison said it very well, which is in our system of government, it is for people to criticize the government, not for government to criticize people or silence people. But there's an interesting spin on your question, which is we've had a couple of incidents, including at a law school in California, where there were complaints that students, and they may have actually been Chinese students as well as American students, who were criticizing the certain Chinese government policies. And some students complained, that's hate speech against Chinese people or Chinese Americans. And those two are absolutely distinguishable. Hate speech is speech that denigrates individuals on the basis of their identity, of who they are. To denigrate the policies of a government is distinguishable. I wrote to the dean of the law school who punished a faculty member for writing a blog post that was critical of certain Chinese government policies. And the dean of the law school was actually treating this as hate speech against Chinese people. And I used to be very active in international human rights, including with respect to a number of Asian countries. And you cannot engage in human rights without critiquing government policies, right? You cannot advocate for any kind of reform, whether it's Black Lives Matter in this country, without criticizing government policies. So that, to me, if there's any speech that's going to be protected in our political system, it has to be the right, including, we want to overprotect free speech or in that direction rather than the opposite.
So we're going to go 5 to 7 minutes over, so prepare yourselves. We're going to do one more round of questions. I see a microphone here and a microphone there, but let's start. Do you still have a microphone in your hand? Yeah. Yeah, you go first, then we'll go here, and I see one in the middle. Go ahead.
I'm Anna, and I'm considering...
I don't see where you are, Anna. I'm so sorry.
Hi.
Oh, hi.
I'm considering a global studies and French double major. And so in the context of your book, you mention like private sector institutions and their obligation to move towards like protecting free speech. Does that include the abolition of these free speech areas and like in the context of the opposition of like the other areas being non-free speech areas? And sorry, this is kind of multifaceted, but like, do you consider the idea of like safe spaces to be inherently unconstitutional in private sector and public sector areas? And like, what would be a constitutional option for people that feel unsafe in public areas besides these safe spaces, if they are inherently unconstitutional? Sorry.
Great, thanks. Gabriel?
Hi, my name is Gabriel. I am a Latin American Studies and Spanish double major. My question is, do you believe that regulations around speech should be decided by members of the community? And what do you think are equitable ways that people would be selected to make those regulations?
Great. Last question, right in the center.
Hi. My name is Sai. I'm a freshman and I am a perspective sociology major. Thank you for such a great talk. And my question for you would be, do you think there is like a positive correlation between free speech and hate speech? I mean, do you feel like hate speech often comes along with free speech?
I had that as one of my questions too.
Okay. Wow, these are such interesting questions, and I apologize in advance because they're all very subtle and complex, and I can't do justice to them, and consistent with not keeping you here all night. I also want to apologize because my instinct and my preference as a professor and as somebody who's always trying to learn is I really would love to know what you think. The person who asked me the question, what do you think in response to your question? And I would really love to hear what the rest of you think about these excellent questions, but I'm going to have to deny myself that pleasure, but hopefully there will be ways for you to discuss among yourselves. So Anna, you raised a number of complex points, but the concept of safe spaces is, there's no legal concept of safe spaces, and it's a term that has been used very, very differently. So in different contexts. Every person has a fundamental right to life, to safety, and that's why no other right is absolute, including free speech, to prevail over that. So if you can show that speech presents an emergency, that there is, among other things, an emergency would certainly consist of an imminent threat to life or safety or physical integrity, And one of the subcategories that the Supreme Court has recognized of speech that satisfies the emergency standard is one that's been in the news a lot since January 6th, is intentional incitement of imminent violence that is likely to happen imminently. And so if that standard can be satisfied, the speech is not protected. But the concept of safe spaces has also been used, and you are entitled to that degree of protection of your safety everywhere, in public spaces and private spaces alike. Going back to the Charlottesville example, there was enormous criticism afterwards, including by a nonpartisan commission that was a report that was commissioned by the city council there. What went wrong, what led to this horrible violence and loss of life and injuries. And the consensus was that law enforcement had failed in its most fundamental duty, which is to protect safety. And this was a failure at every level, starting with the university police, going all the way up to the FBI. That there should have been arrests even before the Saturday events. There should have been arrests on Friday night, and that did not happen. Where Heather Heyer got killed, there was not a single law enforcement officer that was stationed in a whole large area. So that degree of safety we should not take for granted. I would wish that we could take it for granted, but unfortunately we can't. When you get beyond that, sometimes the concept of safe space has been used, particularly on campuses, public and private alike, as like special rooms or buildings or dormitories that are set aside for affinity groups, minority or underrepresented or historically marginalized or oppressed groups of students, to feel that they will be with people who share their background, their affinity, and that they can comfortably relax. And I think that an exchange in frank and candid dialogue with each other, I think that kind of safe space is permissible. I would oppose a concept of it that excluded other people, but that that this was the primary purpose of creating that space. Interestingly enough, even the University of Chicago, which famously and controversially a few years ago, a dean, it wasn't the president of the university, issued a letter to all incoming students and said, we absolutely oppose safe spaces and trigger warnings. And it turned out that this other concept of safe space, and I'm sure to his defense he wasn't using it that way, but it's such a vague term. You have to say, well, what exactly do we mean by it? And it turned out they did have safe spaces for LGBTQ and other traditionally marginalized students, even with their strong defense of free speech. Now, the third way that it has been used, and this is the one that I think is problematic, deeply problematic from a First Amendment and academic freedom and other points of view, is that you should be safe from hearing ideas or expression that you consider to be, offensive, traumatic, evil, dangerous. If it's short of the emergency standard, you should not be protected from those ideas. You certainly should be protected from, having somebody, harass you, target you and repeat an idea. You should be free to walk away without this person impeding you. But that's the way you deal with it, either ignoring it, turning your back on it, or if you choose, answering it back. And I'm so sorry, that was just the first question, and I've really self-censored my answer. My goodness, I'll try to go faster. But I'm trying to be respectful, because I realize these are very complicated questions. Forgive me. I can't do justice to them. Gabriel, thank you for following up, I think, on my suggestion that members of the community should play a very important role in crafting the rules of the road and the guidelines and the standards and the expectations for their community. But I would not say that the ultimate decision should be made by majority vote, because I'm always concerned about protecting rights of the minority, and that's the whole concept of individual rights, is that, as the Supreme Court said, that one's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, other fundamental rights should not be subject to majority vote. They do not depend on the outcome of any election. And that's that wonderful idea that in our system of government, most public policy decisions are made by the majority or by elected officials who are accountable to the majority. But the framers, they made a lot of mistakes, but I think they got this right when they said there are some rights that are so fundamental that just an aspect of human dignity to which every individual is entitled. And we know they didn't live up to it, but that was the aspiration, which is laudable, that no majority, no matter how large, should be able to take them away from any minority, no matter how small or despised that minority might be. So I think there should definitely be input and participation and consultation and recommendation by the majority, but if it has to do with something as fundamental as free speech, it should not be decided ultimately by the majority. And then Cy, I'm not sure if I got that name. Cy, yes. The correlation between free speech and hate speech, absolutely, but also love speech, right? The more free speech you have, the more of every kind of message there's going to be, positive and negative. And the Supreme Court in a recent case said it very well when it said, and here's kind of, there are a lot of distorted, caricatured views about free speech. A lot of people say that those of us who defend free speech very strongly, including the United States Supreme Court, deny the harm in speech, or those of us who defend free speech for hate speech deny the harm in the hate speech. Not at all. The Supreme Court said it's precisely because speech is so powerful that we protect it, and that power can be used for great harm as well as for great good. The question is, what is more harmful, the speech or the censorial power? And to take social media, for example, it's true, and most of the attention is focused on the negative use of it, the disinformation, the misinformation, the hate speech, the extremist speech, and we tend to take for granted the huge positive, right? You've all grown up with the internet, and you don't remember the days when it was impossible. A.J. Liebling in the second half of the 20th century he was a journalist who, one of his famous quips was very sarcastically, freedom of the press belongs to he who owns a printing press, meaning that we don't really have meaningful free speech. Well, now, if, not everybody can afford a cell phone, but an infinitely larger number of people can afford to buy a printing press. And you basically have a printing press in your pocket now, where you can potentially reach every person in the world, can potentially reach every other person in the world. And I think of all of the movements that could not have gotten off the ground were it not for the social media. The ACLU started campaigning against police violence, excessive violence and killing, against dark-skinned, mostly younger men, as early as the organization was founded. Same thing more than 100 years ago. Same thing with the NAACP. And we tried. One of the first things that happened when I was president was the videotaping of the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles. I don't know if people even remember that. And we tried to make that into a big crusade. And why is it that there's so many killings that had happened and so many efforts by so many activists never got traction until what? The power of social media and The same thing with the Me Too movement. So let's not, sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater. The other thing about social media is, in addition to increasing hate speech, the prevalence of it, counter speech is so much easier than it's been before too. And there's just wonderful experimentation and creative and research efforts going on about how can we harness this powerful new tool to more effectively, proactively rebut the hate speech.
There's a lot to unpack related to free speech. I feel like we could be here for hours, but we can't. So we're going to have to wrap up. I do want to say to those who are watching online now or later, and to the audience, just to remind you of two upcoming free speech events that we have. One is next Friday from noon to 1. It will be hybrid, in person and on Zoom. It will be with ACLU Senior Staff Attorney Emerson Sykes.
He's fantastic. Please attend.
She recommended him, and we really tracked him down. Emerson's going to be talking about free speech protections on campus. It's just going to be an open Q&A on everything from protest rights to Black student activism and more. So we really hope you can join for that. And then November 16th, is Aaron Hanlon still in the audience? He is, and so is Crystal. Professors Aaron Hanlon, Professors Crystal Kessler, and Professor from chemistry or biology? Chemistry. So we have chemistry, we have English, and we have sociology coming together to do a faculty-led conversation on does free speech give us better science? That will be 7 p.m. in this auditorium on November 16th. Of course, all of that, you should follow Goldfarb Center on Instagram so that you can know when all these things are. But before we end, let's give a huge round of applause to Nadine.
Oh, thank you. Thank all of you for your great questions. Thank you. And thank you for your great questions.
I asked too many. I didn't know the time. It just kind of flies by. Thank you all. If you're interested in Nadine signing your book, we'll just do it right outside in the lobby, okay? Grab some swag, grab some candy as you wish.